Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining today's lecture. So the program for the day is that we will begin by sort of summarizing the last lecture that we had, and then to discuss, we would have an opportunity to discuss any issues that arise out of that lecture that you would like to talk about. So please think now about whether you would like to post any questions or comments using the chat function. So you may already have some questions, or there may be some that arise out of the summary, but please do take advantage of that. We will then look at issues of membership and governance of international financial institutions, and we may make a start on internal administration and external stakeholders. So that's the program for today. So let's begin then with a summary of the third lecture, where we were looking at multilateral financial institutions as intergovernmental organizations. So we noted that relevant terms are not always self-explanatory and that definitions can be useful. In particular, the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties defines international organizations as intergovernmental organizations. And the International Law Commission, in its draft articles on the responsibility of international organizations, provided a definition of international organizations involving three elements. Namely, that they be established by treaty or other instrument governed by international law, that they possess their own international legal personality, and that they may include as members not only states, but, quote, other entities. At the lecture, we considered this definition in the context of international financial institutions. We recalled first that all of the major IFIs were established by a treaty, a consequence of which is that public international law governs not only the establishment of the international financial institution, but also its organization and operations. Secondly, we noted that IFIs have legal personality, recalling the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice in the reparations case, and observing that the charters of the IFIs have specific provisions enabling them to own property, to sue, and to be sued, attributes of legal personality. Thirdly, and finally, with reference to the definition of international organizations of the International Law Commission, we observed that most members of IFIs are states, but sometimes there are other entities. For example, the European Investment Bank is a member of the EBRD, and Hong Kong is a member of the AIIB. Our consideration of these definitional matters also drew out other issues important for our understanding of IFIs. In particular, the following. First, we discussed the process around the registration of treaties, noting that the United Nations Charter calls for the registration of international agreements, but that registration may only be effected by parties that are states or UN specialized agencies. While sovereign loan and guarantee agreements entered into by IFIs that are not specialized agencies largely go unregistered, this does not affect the validity or enforceability of the agreements, even though this practice does not further the UN Charter objective of making treaties publicly known. Secondly, our discussion of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties led us to recall that some treaties, like the Vienna Convention itself, have provisions that codify tenets of customary international law, while other provisions reflect attempts to progressively develop international law. This explains why some states are not party to such treaties, and yet are still bound by the customary international law rules that those treaties restate. Customary international law, we noted, binds all subjects of public international law, including international financial institutions. Thirdly, and relatedly, we became aware of the practice of IFIs when entering into sovereign agreements with their members, not to seek from those members confirmation of the legal authority of the Minister of Finance to sign such agreements. This practice of assuming that such authority exists takes forward the rule of customary international law, codified in the Vienna Convention, that authority may be assumed where the treaty is being signed by the head of state, head of government, or Minister of Foreign Affairs. In the third lecture, we also considered one of the characteristics of multilateral financial institutions as intergovernmental organizations, namely that they are endowed by their members with special status and exemptions, privileges and immunities. One of the immunities we spent some time considering was so-called jurisdictional immunity. The charters of some IFIs, such as the IBRD and AIIB, provide a high degree of immunity, while others, notably the IFC, provide none. Charter provisions are sometimes expanded upon in headquarters or resident office agreements, which is the case, for instance, with the EBRD in the United Kingdom. Sometimes domestic laws provide for jurisdictional immunity. We also discussed the recent United States Supreme Court decision in the JAMS case, where the court concluded that international organizations addressed by the relevant federal law had no greater jurisdictional immunity than that afforded to states. That is to say, that there is no jurisdictional immunity under the US domestic law for IFIs in relation to their commercial activities. In concluding our third lecture, we explored the concept of preferred creditor status, a defining feature of international financial institutions. We noted that there are two dimensions of preferred creditor status, the first of which is relevant in the sphere of private sector financings. Through the application of charter provisions and supplementing bilateral agreements, members that limit access to convertible currency make an exception for international financial institutions. The benefit of this preference is sometimes shared through the use of the AB loan mechanism with international commercial banks that might otherwise be reluctant to invest in countries and projects where the political risk is perceived as being high. The second dimension of preferred creditor status is relevant in the sphere of sovereign operations, that is, IFI loans to or guarantees from the state member. Where a member is unable to meet its debt obligations to creditor states, often represented by their official export credit agencies and surrogate banks, IFIs traditionally will not be asked by the so-called Paris Club creditors to agree relief for the debtor state, such as the rescheduling of its debts. This tradition is not reflected in any IFI charter provision or other legal commitment and operates solely at the level of practice. Nonetheless, like preferred creditor status generally, this is critical to the operational effectiveness of the IFIs, which are often lenders of last resort. So that is the end of my summary of the last lecture. So I'd like to invite you now to reflect on that. Let's give ourselves a few minutes. And if you do have any comments or questions, please do note them down in the chat. So I can see that people are still reflecting. So there may be comments a little bit later on and we can address them then. But if you are halfway through writing something up, then please do continue. And in the meantime, let's proceed to the next topic that we will address today as part of the program I outlined earlier. So the next big subject that we are going to address is membership. So the slides that you have, from slides 13 to 15, these deal with, from the section about membership and governance, they summarize the key aspects of membership. Who are the subjects? When does membership commence? When and how does it terminate? So I think these are all fairly self-explanatory, or at least an understanding of these issues can be easily obtained from reading these slides. So I would encourage you to read them. But today, I would like to highlight one aspect of membership, namely the withdrawal by a member from an international financial institution. And I would like to discuss this because, not because withdrawal is a common event, but that reviewing the rules around withdrawal enables one to get a fuller understanding of the issues of membership. Now, where a member withdraws from an international financial institution, the international financial institution repurchases the member's shares in accordance with the formula set out in the relevant charter. So shares in international financial institutions, they are not negotiable. So a member cannot decide to transfer some of its shares to another member or indeed to a non-member. If the member wishes to withdraw from the organization, it has to put its shares back to the institution. And the institution purchases those shares at a price that reflects a formula set out in the charter. Now, it is rare for members to withdraw from an international financial institution. In the case of the IBRD, for example, over the course of its history, there's only been a handful of members that have withdrawn. And in many of those cases, the withdrawing members have eventually returned. So, for example, during the Cold War, countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia withdrew, but they did return later following the fall of the Berlin Wall. By contrast, Cuba was a member of the IBRD and has withdrawn, but has not returned, at least not yet. So very few members have withdrawn from the other major international organizations also. It could reasonably be said that, as a generalization, members do not withdraw from international financial institutions. Their membership is marked by a high degree of stability, something, incidentally, which is noted each year in the financial statements of the EBRD, for example. The reason for this is that at one point, the applicable accounting rules provided that where a member of an entity was able to compel the entity to purchase its shares, then the member's interest in the entity should be presented not as equity, as had generally been understood by the IFIs to be the case, but as debt. However, in the case of EBRD, the auditors accepted that the stability in membership was such that no member could be expected to withdraw. This stability was reinforced by the fact that if a member were to withdraw, the most it could receive back would be the amount it originally paid in. So a lot to take in that short description, but let me restate it in a slightly different way. So members in a private sector corporation, when they wish no longer to hold their interest, they typically will transfer their shares to someone else. And as a result of that, the number of shares held by the corporation remains the same. It's just that the ownership changes. And if a shareholder sells its shares to someone else in a corporation, then that does not have any direct bearing on the finances of the institution in which the shares are held. But the situation is different in an international financial institution. So if a member no longer wishes to be a member, and given that it cannot sell its shares to a third party, it is required to put its shares back to the institution. And the institution is required to purchase those shares. Now, there's a separate discussion around what the correct purchase price is, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. But the key point is that when a member leaves and puts the shares back to the international financial institution, the international financial institution has to spend the money of the institution in purchasing those shares. So this presented a dilemma at one point for the international financial institutions, particularly those whose financial statements are presented and prepared in accordance with international financial reporting standards, because it was there that those who prepared and interpreted and expounded upon those rules underscored that where a reporting entity is compelled in instances beyond its control to purchase back shares of members, then those shares should be treated not as equity, but as debt. So you can imagine an international financial institution with billions of dollars in what it thought was equity, which everyone considers to be equity, but which for accounting purposes is considered to be debt. So that can have a tremendous impact on the financial statements of that institution. Now, in the case of the EBRD was able to persuade its auditors that, in fact, it would be misleading to treat the membership interests as though they represented debt rather than equity. And one of the arguments was that it's just the case that when members become members, they do so for the duration of the institution's life. The instances of members withdrawing from international organizations is so rare that, in fact, it reinforces the rule that members never leave international institutions, and therefore there is a very high stability in the membership. So that was accepted by the auditors. So the membership interests in EBRD to be treated as equity rather than debt. Now, at the same time, the African Development Bank, which also prepared its financial statements in accordance with international financial reporting standards, was not able to persuade its auditors of the strength of that argument. And as a result, it went ahead and presented members' interests as equity, but not as debt. But the auditors issued a qualified opinion. And qualified opinions are something that every reporting entity wants to avoid, but it's particularly important for international financial institutions. However, this did not cause any big ripples at the time, because by the time the qualified opinion had come out, it was understood and accepted by all that in a way this was a rather special case, because it was the application of accounting rules that were prepared for reporting entities generally, but without much consideration being given to the special situation in which international financial institutions find themselves in. In the case of the IBRD, up to that point, they had been preparing their financial statements in accordance with two sets of rules. One, the International Financial Reporting Standards, and the other one, the Generally Accepted Accounting Principles of the United States, US GAAP. And because of the difficulties that this rule was presenting at the time, the IBRD abandoned the use of IFIs as a reporting standard, and from that moment prepared its financial statements only in accordance with US GAAP. In many instances, the issues that arise in relation to such withdrawal are the withdrawal of membership from an IFI. They're no different from those that arise in relation to the withdrawal of membership in international organizations generally. However, there are some differences, namely between withdrawing membership from an IFI and withdrawing membership from an international organization generally, that are attributable to the nature of IFIs as financing institutions that generate profits, even if, unlike with private sector companies, the purpose of an IFI is not to maximize the wealth of members. Nonetheless, in pursuing their mandates, IFIs generally apply sound banking principles so that they remain financially sustainable. One consequence of this is that it is common for IFIs to accumulate profits over time, building up reserves in the process. So, in the ordinary course, an IFI, particularly one that's investing in the private sector, can be actively pursuing its mandate, which, as we discussed previously, is some dimension or understanding of development. So this is what drives it. It's not the maximizing of the wealth of the members, which is the objective of a corporation, but rather it's pursuing this development goal. But in pursuing the development goal, the IFI seeks to ensure that it remains financially sustainable. And it needs to do that in order to, first of all, protect the existing capital. Secondly, to avoid the callable capital from having to be called. And thirdly, to build up some reserves that will take the organization through difficult times ahead, but which may also provide a basis for enabling the organization to take on some riskier activities or to expand its existing activities. And so in doing that, reserves can be built up primarily through the accumulation of profits. Now, In corporations, when profits are accumulated, it's very common to look at distributing those profits to the members. So at least once a year, and more often, several times in a year, dividends are paid. So this is a distribution of the profits, but sometimes profits that have been accumulated and not yet distributed. These can be distributed also, and there are different ways in which that can be done, but the net effect is that the accumulated reserves reduce in value. So dividends is a common way of reducing the reserves in companies. Now, international financial institutions, they do provide for the possibility of dividends being paid. However, to my knowledge, no major international financial institution has ever paid a dividend. It has been debated. It was a very serious debate at the EBRD at one point, and it was a major debate because the level of accumulated reserves was very high, and there was a view that the reserves were not needed for the purposes of the institution, and therefore those reserves ought to be taken out of the institution and given back to the members. Now, the counter-argument that was advanced by other members was that, in fact, these reserves are needed for the institution if the institution is to do new things, and they were arguing that the institution ought to do new things. Now, in that case, there was this discussion, and a compromise was reached. And the compromise was that there would be no dividend paid, but instead a large chunk of the accumulated reserves would be taken out of those reserves and would be placed instead in a special fund. And a special fund is a fund that is owned and controlled by the entity, by the international financial institution, but the interests and the assets and the potential obligations are separate from that which is represented by the ordinary capital resources. So if you take the AIIB as an example, the AIIB has ordinary capital resources. It has an authorized capital of 100 billion. It has paid-in capital of about 20 billion. So this is the ordinary capital resources. And in addition, it has a special fund. And the special fund is separate. It's reported separately. If the special fund were to incur losses, those cannot be subsidized by the ordinary capital resources. So they're kept separately, and the special fund resources are created to do some things that is considered not appropriate or convenient to do with the ordinary capital resources. So at the AIIB, the special fund is used to provide support to the least developed countries to enable them to prepare projects for financing consideration by the AIIB. So the poorest countries often don't have the capacity to prepare project proposals. So the idea of the special fund is that there would be money available to pay experts to help those poorest countries prepare project proposals. The special fund also has a window that enables the interests, the interest costs for the poorest countries in relation to COVID borrowing to be subsidized. So that special fund, it's separate from the ordinary capital resources, and it meets a particular interest of the institution, but one for which the ordinary capital resources are not really appropriate or convenient. So what happened at the EBRD was that there was a new special fund created, and this new special fund had those reserves transferred into it. So those reserves were no longer part of the ordinary capital resources of the EBRD, but they became part of the resources of this EBRD special fund. And those monies were used to pay for technical assistance in projects that previously had been financed mainly through donor contributions. And the donors in those instances were often the members of the institution. So this turned out to be a very prescient action, because almost immediately after all of this was implemented, and this was, I think, in about 2008, then there was a very major financial crisis in the world, the 2008-2009 financial crisis. And as a result of that, many countries were no longer in a position to make donor contributions to international financial institutions to support, say, technical assistance. So fortunately at the EBRD, even though those sources of financing temporarily dried up to some extent, the institution had access to a special fund that enabled the EBRD to continue providing technical assistance and grant funding that it wouldn't have been able to do using its ordinary capital resources. So when an international financial institution has accumulated profits that are reflected in the reserves of the institution, then one way it can diminish those reserves, as I said, is by paying a dividend, but that has never happened. Another way is by making a payment for other purposes. And one example of another purpose is a transfer into a special fund, as we have discussed. But nonetheless, at any given time, there's usually a certain balance in the reserves of every institution. And then the question arises, what happens if a member is withdrawing and the institution, as we saw, has to meet the payment obligation to that member? Then how should the member's interest be calculated? And in particular, should the member be entitled to it? Should it be entitled as part of the payment upon its withdrawal to receive its share of the accumulated and undistributed reserves? So this question is generally regulated in the charters of the international financial institutions. So in the case of the EBRD, a member that withdraws receives no share of its reserves. The maximum it can receive is the amount that it paid in. But in the case of, say, the AIIB, a withdrawing member receives its full share of the reserves. So at the EBRD, this situation, as reflected in the charter, was very convenient for the organization in its discussion with the auditors, because it was able to say that no member ever leaves an international financial institution as a rule. And they were able then to go on to say, and in the case of the EBRD, there's actually a financial disincentive to doing that because one could never recover the full value of one's shares. One would have to forfeit one's interest in the accumulated reserves. But that's not an argument that is available to every institution. So a question, I think, for you is to think about what would happen if you were asked to advise a new international financial institution that was about to be established. And if the question is, well, you have to anticipate the possibility of members wishing to leave. If they leave by being compelled to put their shares back to the institution, and if the institution has to buy those shares, then should the departing member be able to receive, as part of the payment, its shares of the accumulated reserves? Or should accumulated reserves be seen as being appropriately the property, as it were, of the remaining members only? And everyone would look to you to seek your advice on what the appropriate thing is to do. So maybe I'll just pause there and ask you to reflect on that question. And if you have a comment or a question, then you can put it in the chat. But please, I'll give you a couple of minutes to reflect on that question. So I wanted now to talk about membership in the international financial institutions generally, but to draw out some of the issues by focusing on one specific international financial institution, namely the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB. And here there are a few observations that we can make. The first is that members of the IBRD and the ADB are eligible for membership in the AIIB. Membership is not open to anyone else, whether that anyone else is a country or is whether an applicant for membership is a country, because membership is only open to countries. And as we saw, it's a difficult question that to be answered because international financial institutions do not have the capacity to recognize statehood. That is something only other states can do. But in the case of the AIIB, that issue does not present itself because there is no reference to members having to be states. And on the contrary, the implication is that members may not be states because membership in the AIIB is open to those who are members of the IBRD or ADB. And in the case of the ADB, there are several members that are not states. One such member of ADB that is not a state is Hong Kong. And Hong Kong is a member now of the AIIB. In fact, it's the AIIB's only member that is not a state. Relatedly, North Korea is not a member of either the World Bank or ADB, and that means that it is not eligible for membership in the AIIB. Now, membership in an institution is important for a whole host of reasons. One of them, of course, is that in the ordinary course, to be a recipient of the institution's financial support, one has to be a member. But there are exceptions to this. So in the case of the AIIB, there is a provision in its charter enabling it to provide financial support to non-members in exceptional cases where the bank's highest governance body concludes that there is a special need, and it's a conclusion that is reached by applying a very high voting threshold. So one could see, for instance, the possibility of a politically difficult situation being addressed at a political level, and as part of the package of measures to address the problem, the international financial institutions are asked to provide support, even though the affected country may not be a member. So that may be an instance where this provision in the AIIB Charter might be relevant. If one looks at the legacy international financial institutions, one can also see that there are ways of providing support to non-members. And there are examples one can look at the IBRD and the EBRD to support this. So in the case of the IBRD, at point there was a general consensus that the World Bank should do something to assist Palestine. But Palestine was not a member of the IBRD. And the way in which that was addressed is that there was a legal opinion that was issued saying that in the view of the General Council, it was consistent with the charter of the IBRD if some of the accumulated profits set out in the reserves were to be alienated from the institution, but applied for the benefit of Palestine, which ultimately would be for the benefit of the membership generally. So that's an example of how the IBRD provided support on the territory of a non-member. At the EBRD, the same issue has arisen from time to time. One interesting example is when the war in Kosovo was coming to an end, then there was a document called the Dayton Agreement. Well, actually, the Dayton. So there were a number of wars in the Balkans. So, but one of the wars came to an end with the Dayton Accord. Another one came to an end and was reflected in a Security Council resolution. So the Dayton Accord is important for understanding the history, and there are a number of legal issues that arose from that which international financial institutions had to deal with. And I can mention one of them now, and that is that if you were financing a project on the territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina, then if there was a sovereign loan, it was important to prepare the project in such a way that it would have support from the different political entities that made up the state, as well as from the different ethnic communities, because any one of those players could disrupt the approval of the project. And I recall working on a transport project that was prepared after the date in the court had been signed, but before any elections had been called. So it was a very difficult period, but at least fighting had stopped. And the EBRD had been asked by one of the two constituent parts of Bosnia and Herzegovina, namely the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, if it would finance the reconstruction of some roads. And it agreed to do that, but only on condition that it was also able to finance something in the other political part of, or the other political subdivision of Bosnia and Herzegovina, namely Republika Srpska. And there was a bridge that was reconstructed using EBRD funding. And that was important because when the sovereign loan went to the parliament for approval, it needed the approval of both the Federation of Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina as well as Republika Srpska. So the calculation was made that no support would be forthcoming unless there was something in the deal for every political subdivision. And that was a reflection of the fact that Dayton, which was wonderful for bringing the war to an end, it did not exactly provide model government or at least a model of efficient government. So projects in Bosnia and Herzegovina have always been very difficult for international financial institutions, but it is possible to finance them. So moving on to Kosovo, when the NATO-led war came to an end, there was a United Nations Security Council resolution that provided for a number of things. And one thing that it did was that it stated that the territorial integrity over Kosovo of Serbia was preserved, but that the administration of that sovereignty would pass to a new United Nations body. So the United Nations body was effectively administering Kosovo on behalf of the United Nations, but according to the Security Council resolution, the sovereign territory was that of Serbia. And a difficulty at the time was that there was a great need for financial support. There was a high degree of political uncertainty, so commercial banks were going to be unlikely to come to the assistance of Kosovo. And the United Nations called on the international financial institutions that operate in the region to lend support. The difficulty for EBRD was that Serbia was not a member at the time of EBRD. So Kosovo was on the territory of Serbia, according to the UN Security Council resolution. And under the EBRD's charter, it was confined to providing support to its members. So what to do if it was to support Kosovo? And this was a challenging issue, but a legal opinion was eventually issued and the board of directors adopted a legal view. They adopted a legal view based on a recommendation of the General Council. And that legal view was that it would be possible to use not the ordinary capital resources of the EBRD, but donor resources that would be mobilized by the EBRD in order to support activity on the territory of a country that was not a member of the EBRD. So the EBRD was not able to use its ordinary capital resources. It could not use its special fund resources because all those resources belong to the EBRD. So ordinary capital resources and special fund resources, they belong to the institution. That's the case at all institutions that have that concept. That includes the AIIB and it includes the ADB. But at the EBRD, the funds that were used to support Kosovo were provided by donors, and they continued to be owned by the donors, but they were just administered by the EBRD, and the costs of administration were all met by the donors. So that was an exceptional situation, but no EBRD funds were used, and the exception was considered justified because of the call of the international community on IFIs in the neighborhood, as it were, to provide support to Kosovo. So there are ways in exceptional situations where international financial institutions can provide support to non-members. But in the ordinary course, if a country or a territory wishes to obtain support from an international financial institution, it has to become a member. So that's why membership is so important for recipient countries, and for countries and territories that never expect to be borrowers of an international financial institution. Membership is very important nonetheless for them for a host of political reasons. One is that they want to have some influence over the institution. So in the case of the IBRD or the regional development banks, as we've seen before, the majority of the shares are owned by the countries that are not expected to be borrowers of the institution, but they become members in order to advance their own domestic agendas, their own domestic political agendas. And those domestic political agendas can range from preserving the peace to supporting development and everything in between. So by becoming members, those countries that don't expect to borrow still achieve something on their domestic agenda. And by becoming members, if they will have some influence in the setting of the strategies and the policies and the major decisions of the institution. And the larger the economic power, as we've seen in the past, the more shares, the more voting power. So this is why not only membership, but the degree of influence as a member is important for countries and territories that become members. Now, returning to the AIIB as our example, this provides for both regional and non-regional members. Now, the region is defined as Asia and Oceania, as classified by the United Nations Statistical Division. That's the default rule, unless the Articles or the Board of Governors decides otherwise. Now, in the Articles of the AIIB, the whole of the Russian Federation is expressed as being part of the region of Asia and Oceania. And this displaces the assumption that it is the UN Statistical Division assessment that determines whether a country or territory is within or outside of the region. So in the case of Russia, the UN views the whole of the Russian Federation as being part of Eastern Europe. But at the AIIB, the whole of the Russian Federation is viewed as being part of Asia and Oceania. So this distinction between regional and non-regional members, this exists at all the international financial institutions. And, this exists at all of the international financial institutions that are regional IFIs. So the purpose of the regional IFIs is to draw on global support and global funding to support the advancement of development in a particular region, such as Africa or such as Asia. Now, a consequence at the international financial institutions that are regional development banks is that non-regional members are not eligible for financial support. The exception is the AIIB. So the AIIB has language in its charter, and more pertinently, it has language in some of the documents that surround the establishment of the institution, which make it clear that it is possible for the institution to pursue its objective of supporting development in its region by not only investing directly in its region, but by investing indirectly or investing in projects outside of the region. Now, at the other international financial institutions and at the IBRD, it is possible to invest indirectly in a non-regional member country. Sorry, ignore the IBRD, not a good example. But in the non-regional IFIs, it is possible to finance a project in the region, but by investing in the money in a non-region, or even potentially in a non-member country. So we saw the other day that when investing in funds, it's quite often the case that the IFI is investing in a fund that is incorporated in a non-member country. But the project, the purpose of the fund, or the use of the proceeds, is always connected directly to the region. So if there is a fund that has been set up to help finance infrastructure development in Southeast Asia, and if the fund is incorporated in the Cayman Islands, then the Cayman Islands has been chosen because it provides a good opportunity for those who have set up the fund and are managing it to be able to attract investment from international investors. But the project is not in the Cayman Islands. The project is in Southeast Asia. But the Caymans and the fund structure, they provide a means by which the IFI is able to invest in the region. So that happens in all of the IFIs, but the AIIB is a little bit different because it can also do that, but in addition, it is able to invest in projects that are outside of its region. So the AIIB is able to invest in projects outside of its region as long as there is a significant benefit to its region. So this is a legal view that was offered by the General Counsel at the AIIB, and that's a view that has been accepted by the Board of Directors. And on the basis of that legal view, a strategy for investing in non-regional members has been approved by the AIIB Board of Directors. And the key legal requirement is that there must be a significant benefit to Asia if there are to be investments outside of Asia. and the strategy articulates what amounts to a significant benefit. And an example of what is a significant benefit is if there is a project in a country that is immediately adjacent to the region where the AIB ordinarily invests, and the economy is so closely integrated with the economy of the region, and the project is of a nature that it is going to be affected by that relationship, then it is possible to invest in that country. And the example that has been settled upon at the AIB is Egypt. So Egypt is part of Africa, according to the UN United Nations Statistical Division. A cartographer would place the Sinai in Asia, but for the UN, the whole of Egypt is part of Africa, and that has not been displaced by the AIB articles or by any decision of the AIB Board of Governors. So the AIB can invest in Egypt because doing so will have a significant benefit to Asia. So that's one example. Another one would be if the AIB is, say, financing a transport corridor or financing transport infrastructure that runs through a corridor that links several countries, some of which are in the region and some of which are outside, then one could look at the totality of what is being financed and see that there is a benefit that is accruing to the region. And then the third reason is the most interesting one, which is that the AIB is able to finance projects in non-regional members where doing so generates an acceptable or desirable for AIB public good. And the kind of projects that the AIB has financed in this area are where there is a project outside of the region that is going to be able to mitigate the effects of climate change or to achieve greater energy security, or is going to reduce emissions. This will benefit not only the country hosting the project, but it will benefit the whole world, including, of course, the region that AIB has been set up to support. So this is unique among the major international financial institutions to AIIB, but it is an example of where the division between the region and the non-region can be somewhat blurred, whereas there is a very stark distinction at the other institutions. So the other institutions, you cannot finance projects outside of the region. At the AIB, you can finance projects outside of the region, provided there is a significant benefit to the region. And a good example of a significant benefit is if a public good is being generated by investing in the non-regional member. So returning to the charter of the AIB, at the time when it was signed, there were 57 states. They were all states that signed the articles. And of those 57 states, today 54 of them are members. 3 of them continue to go through their ratification process. And in the case of one of them, that process is very advanced. But since the articles were adopted, there have been additional members. And the additional members, they have had their membership applications approved by the Board of Governors, so that the total number of approved members is 103. And of those 103, 82 are already members, and 21 are prospective members. That is to say, their membership has been approved by the AIB, but they continue to go through their domestic ratification processes. And as I mentioned at an earlier class, most major economies are members of the AIIB. All members of the G20 are members other than the United States, Japan, and Mexico. So let me mention one other aspect about membership, and that is the process around the admission of new members. So the charter of all the international financial institutions, it provides who the original members will be. And then they all have a provision that anticipates the possibility of new members being admitted. In some instances, the process is left in a very fluid or abstractly expressed manner, and it's then left to the Board of Governors to determine what should happen. So that's the case, for example, of the AIIB. In other instances, it could be highly regulated, which is the case at the EBRD. And the difficulty at the EBRD is that the charter refers to categories of countries that existed at the time, that made sense at the time when the articles were adopted, but make less sense now. But it's very difficult to change that. So as an example, it referred to one category of countries which were European community countries. And then it listed those countries, but it didn't anticipate the possibility that the European Union, as it is now, would expand and would adopt more countries. And it also has a category of countries which are identified as recipient countries. And these categories are seemingly closed. And those categories just shows you how much the world has changed. But the categories of recipient countries included East Germany, which of course became absorbed to the German Federal Republic. It included Czechoslovakia, which of course is split into two, the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic. It included the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which separated following a violent war and now has a number of successor states, 7 or 8 successor states. And it included the Soviet Union, which of course dissolved. So, and was replaced by a number of other successor states. So that has presented a number. So, and some of those countries which are now recipient members at EBRD are also members of the European Union. But if you look at the relevant annex of the Charter of the AIIB, it's very difficult to reconcile today's world with the world that was described in the annex to the EBRD Charter. And it's raised a number of issues, including those dealing with governance and representation. But I think that's an exception. The EBRD trying to regulate everything and envisaging that the world will never change. One sees that quite often in international organizations. If you look at the United Nations, there is a system, as you know, at the Security Council of a number of states having a veto. Now, those states just happened to be the victors during the Second World War. And of course, they had all the sway at the time, so they chose for themselves a veto. They could have had a formula. They could have said, you know, the veto shall be available for states that are have a certain population or have a certain economic power, or possess nuclear weapons, or could have been anything, but it would envisage the possibility of countries slipping in and out of the Security Council, but it didn't do that. And so the Security Council veto arrangements today don't reflect today's world, but reflect the world as it was in 1945. And I think that's true for some of the international financial institutions, even the allocation of shares based on economic power. That over time, that economic power can change. So if you had an international financial institution that was set up 100 years ago, then the great economic powers in many instances wouldn't exist any longer. They'd be very different. But nonetheless, the way in which these things work is that the allocation of shares reflects the economic power at the time of the membership application. And there's no easy process for making subsequent adjustments. And in fact, this was one of the problems at the World Bank and the IMF, where there was insufficient political support to enable some countries, notably China, which had become much more economically powerful, to be given a level of influence that reflected their economic power. It's probably one of the factors, according to some commentators, that helped encourage China to promote a new institution, namely the AIB, but also encouraged the so-called BRICS countries to promote their own institution, namely the New Development Bank, which is headquartered in Shanghai. Now, when new members apply in accordance with charter provisions that are common to all the international financial institutions, then it's up to the Board of Governors to then set the terms of membership. And one of the issues is what should be the price, or what should be the par value. So what should be the price to be paid for the shares relative to the par value? So the tradition appears to be that new shares are always issued at par. And in fact, the charters of some of the institutions either require that or have that as a default rule, which can always be displaced by the Board of Governors. But it does mean that a new member that joins at a time when the reserves of the institution have been built up, and if it's only buying the shares at par value, then it receives a windfall in that it has a beneficial interest, if you like, in the accumulated reserves of the institution, even though it's never contributed to the profits that those reserves represent, the undistributed profits that those reserves represent. Now, in institutions where a departing member is not entitled to any part of the reserves, then maybe that doesn't matter. But it does seem to me to be not entirely satisfactory if a new member can acquire shares at par, and then immediately afterwards, theoretically, it could leave the organization and receive a payment from the institution of an amount that reflects not only its paid-in shares, but also its share of the accumulated profits. So I mention this not because it's such a major issue, but it does help further contextualize the whole issue about withdrawing members having or not having access to the reserves of the institution at the time of their departure. So that's all I wanted to say on membership. Let me just pause there and see if there are any questions. And if not, if there are any comments that people would like to raise. And please, let's just pause for a few minutes. But if you could write something into the chat function, that would be helpful. Thank you. So while you continue to reflect and to write your comments and questions, let me answer one of the questions that has been raised in relation to the last class, and this is to do with legal personality and the ability of the international organization not only to sue but also to be sued. And the question was, in what circumstances might this arise, and is it a desirable thing for an international financial institution to be sued? So I think that that I can answer this question, I guess, in an abstract way, and one with, and partly by referring to some specific examples. So in the abstract way, I would say that international financial institutions and all international organizations, they need to be held accountable for their actions. So there are different ways in which they can do this, and it needs to be done not only because those institutions are accountable to their members for what they do, but also that their actions can affect third parties, so they need to be accountable to them. And the idea of jurisdictional immunity is not to shield the institutions from liability, but it's rather to achieve some efficiency in addressing complaints. If there were no jurisdictional immunity, then potentially wherever jurisdiction would arise, the institution would have to defend itself in potentially multiple jurisdictions around the world. Now, you might think, well, that happens with large corporations. Why should it be any different? And I think that's a reasonable argument. But the counter argument is that corporations can't really do very much about that. But for the members who establish an international financial institution, they can. And they can decide that it's a more efficient use of the capital of the institution if it can defend itself in a more efficient way. It would remain accountable, but it would be accountable in following processes that are agreed upon by all of the members. So that's the answer in the abstract. With regard to the specifics, I think that suits can arise in a number of instances. A very common one is that the international financial institutions raise funds. So if they're raising funds, particularly if they're issuing bonds, then the bondholders need to know that they can hold the institution accountable for honoring the obligations under the bonds. And institutions that issue bonds either don't have any jurisdictional immunity in relation to that activity, or they do, but they waive that immunity, or they provide a mechanism for enabling complaints to be handled. But for those investing in bonds, there would be a great reluctance to invest in bonds of an institution which, if it were not to honor its obligations, could not be held accountable by those bondholders. So that's one example. Another one is, as we saw in the JAMS case that we discussed yesterday, there can be complaints by third parties against international financial institutions. So it happened there. The particular issue was whether jurisdictional immunity existed under a domestic statute. But leaving that aside, there's no doubt that the international financial institution that does not have jurisdictional immunity can be held to account in a court that has jurisdiction. And then finally, I would just note that not all countries in the world are members of an international financial institution. So in the case of the AIIB, Japan is not a member. So if there were a case against the AIIB in circumstances where a Japanese court had jurisdiction, which is already quite a hurdle, I imagine, for a Japanese court to take jurisdiction over a case involving an IFI in relation to the financing of a project outside of Japan. But if nonetheless Japan were to have jurisdiction in such a case, then the AIIB would be able to be sued in the courts of the territory of a non-member. So that's my answer to that question. So please do continue, if you are already writing, to complete your comments. And in the meantime, let us start with our discussion on governance. So governance at international financial institutions, it's about the allocation and exercise of power in decision-making. It's about the manner in which those decisions are informed and how the institution is held to account for the decisions it makes. Good governance implies that power is distributed rationally and fairly, and that it is exercised responsibly, that decisions are transparently and soundly made, and that the institution is accountable not only to its members, but to those affected by its actions. Good governance is also something that is demanded by the rule of law. And this is as relevant to international organizations as it is to states. I have arranged to distribute to you the link to the rule of law at the AIIB, which appears on the AIIB webpage. And in the introduction there, it has a passage which I think is relevant for today's purposes. So let me read this. The AIIB strives to operate in accordance with the highest standards of transparency and accountability. To that end, AIIB undertakes to adhere to the rule of law in its organization, operations, and management. This means that AIIB is to be governed within a well-defined external and internal legal framework, that proper legal regulatory mechanisms are put in place to ensure its activities strictly follow this framework, and that it may be held to account for adverse consequences in case of contravention or violation of those legal norms. So one common way in which IFIs address how the question of how power should be allocated and exercised is by having rules regarding both the participation of members in decision-making, that is voting, and high-level appointments. So I want to talk about those in a little bit more detail. So the participation of members in decision-making is really about voting. And we have already spoken about how the principle in international organizations generally of one member, one vote is displaced in IFIs, where the prevailing principle is that voting power is largely a function of economic power, not entirely, because there is also an attempt to give voice to all members, irrespective of the size of their economy. But in large part, economic power is the determinant of voting power. There are also rules that sometimes regulate high-level appointments. For example, requiring that the executive head be a national of a member state or of a country in the region of focus of the IFIs. So at the AIIB, for example, the charter provides that the president must be a national of a country from the region. But not all IFIs have such express text, but many do. There are frequently established processes for making senior appointments, for example, through the election by the Board of Governors or appointment by the Board of Directors. The outcome of those processes is influenced by how the allocation of voting among members is made, given that they are represented at the Board of Governors and Directors. So often, the rules about high-level appointments are not stated in the charters of the IFIs, but they're reflected in the practice of the institution. For example, the heads of the IMF, the World Bank, and the ADB have always been European, American, and Japanese, respectively. So there's nothing in the ADB charter that says the president must be Japanese, but that has always been the case. And the level of shareholding that Japan holds is not sufficient to enable it, acting alone, to be able to insist on its choice of candidate for president. But there are these practices. The same at the IBRD. So at the IBRD, the president has always been American. And at the IMF, the president has always been a European. And so this arrangement is criticized by many countries. Australia makes a point, it seems to me, of frequently complaining about the system, because of course Australia is not the United States, it's not Japan, and it's not a European country. So it will never be able to have a candidate that leads one of these institutions. But its point of principle is that the institution and the members would be best served if the best possible candidate who was available and ready to take on the job were to be appointed, irrespective of their nationality. But that's not the case at the IMF or the IBRD or the ADB. And indeed, at the AIB, the candidate must always be from the region. And at the EBRD, the candidate must always be a member, and must always be a national of a member state. So sometimes the charters regulate these points, and sometimes it is the practice of the institutions. So a question for you, and again, put yourself in the position of someone who is advising on the drafting of a charter of a new institution. Should this issue be regulated, and if so, how? So something for you to think about. Should the international financial institutions be headed by the most meritorious person who's available and willing to take on the job, or should there be these kind of restrictions? for whatever purpose. So do think about that. And if you have comments, again, do place them in the comments in the chat section. Now let me say a bit more about the governance at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So you have slides, and I think slides 26 to 33 summarize the key features of governance at the bank. So I'm not going to repeat those here. However, I would like to highlight a couple of aspects that are brought about by either the charter of the AIB or decisions of various governance bodies. And I'm going to look at some elements of commonality that are familiar to us already to some extent as a result of the lectures we've had, but these are features that are common to all of the major international financial institutions. And then we're also going to look at a number of innovations in the AIIB Charter. So the AIIB Charter can be viewed as part of a continuum of the story of IFIs. The AIIB is clearly part of the family of IFIs. But the Charter also provides for a number of innovations as well. And this represents a departure, or maybe even the progressive development of IFIs. And then I also want to look at a number of decisions that have been made by the AIIB, which enhance good governance. So these we will discuss at our next lecture. But here I wanted to pause and first of all, see if there are any new chat comments. I don't see any, but that's fine. I know you were reflecting on these points. Keep them with you, and we can look at them at the next class. So let me stop today's lecture there.